a bit of background on the life cycle of solar panels and also the production of them. Now, I'm by no means an expert on this, so this will definitely be a boilerplate introduction to this, but basically you have a polysilicon, which is the raw material used to capture the sun's energy that gets turned into ingots, and then those ingots are sliced into wafers. Those wafers are the little blue squares you see on solar panels that are eventually put together to make cells, and then that module is put together with a frame going around it and different laminates to protect it from the elements. So that's just a little bit of an understanding of the solar panel itself. Now, as far as the lifetime or the lifespan of these panels, typically with tier one modules, we're looking at a 25-year warranty and a lifespan that is guaranteed for 25 years, though panels will often continue to produce beyond that. The one thing to watch out for with the panel's lifespan is that the efficiency will drop. So that's something we talk about as a degradation rate. So different panels have different degradation rates. Some have better ones. Those are typically more expensive, and some have less. And that's basically the amount that the panel is going to decrease in production at the end of its lifespan. So those panels will still produce, but the amount of the number of watts coming off the panel will decrease over time. As far as maintenance and operation goes, for most solar panels, there's not really a ton of maintenance. It's good to keep them clean, brush the snow off them, make sure there's not dust on them. But for the most part, they should be able to function independently over the course of that lifespan. Of course, there are issues that will come up, and that's part of why we recommend going to an installer. They can do any sort of fixing of the panel after the fact if it's needed. And for recycling, I think this is a big question that we're getting more and more. I think people are becoming more conscious about what actually happens with the products that they purchase and use. Now, Montana doesn't really have any sort of solar recycling plants active currently. They're a few states away. Unfortunately, in the Mountain West, we're kind of isolated just due to our low population, but it is growing, and I imagine that'll just get better over time. One note here, the REC silicon plant in Butte, it looks like does do some amount of recycling, but it's mainly on different components of a solar system. I don't know enough about what exactly they take and don't take. And as we'll get to later, they're also shutting down part of their operation. So that could be changing in the near future. But that's just a little bit of background on recycling. Now, for sourcing, one thing that I think us inside the industry know quite a bit about is the different tiers of solar panels. So generally speaking, it's just two tiers, tier one and tier two. And as you can see in that picture, tier one panels are 2% of the manufacturers, but 2/3 of the total solar panels installed or produced yearly. Now, these tiers aren't based off of quality, efficiency, anything like that with the panel. It's purely a business and financial way of separating panels. And so that came from the Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And it's basically a way to measure a company's ability to get loans from banks and just basically be a healthy functioning company. So what that's important for end users, installers, anybody who's looking to get solar installed on their homes or for a business, something like that. Tier one panels are going to be a good option just because they are trusted and protected. So if the panel breaks, you can expect that that warranty will be fulfilled throughout the lifespan of the panel. So that's just something to watch out for. If you have a tier one panel, you should be able to collect on that warranty should something happen, and then also trust that the company's not just going to be out of business in a couple of years. That being said, tier two, there's plenty of tier two manufacturers that make great panels. It's just hard to quantify how reliable that will be. And something that McKenna mentioned in the introduction for me is the solar coaster. And I think this is predominantly where that term comes from, which is just generally talking about the solar market as a bit of a roller coaster. There's lots of ups and downs. There's a very large graveyard of companies that have manufactured different parts of the solar system that have since gone. So it's still a relatively new industry. And with that, any sort of market fluctuation can result in companies going out of business. which can jeopardize warranties, service work, stuff like that for panels. So that's part of why the tiers are important within solar. Now getting to the meat of it, made in the USA and what exactly that means. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to give you guys a very strong answer for what that means right now, just since it is such a new push from the government and just from manufacturers in general. A lot of these, especially the tier one manufacturers, are so large that it's very hard to transition their production to being predominantly in the United States. But we're seeing a lot of different manufacturing companies doing so. So there's a list up there: QCell, Silfab, Mission, First Solar, and many more are producing panels locally, stateside. But the size of that production is not necessarily the highest. And due to a multitude of factors, those panels can oftentimes be more expensive, though not always. So it's growing. I expect it'll continue to grow over the near future, but it is by no means a large percent of the solar panels that are installed or produced globally. So some limitations with that. Lots of the manufacturing that's in the United States currently, while it is assembled in the United States, most of those components aren't necessarily locally sourced from the United States. A lot of the component part of this is still dominated by China, Southeast Asia, and the like. So for example, like an N-phase microinverter, while many of them are now assembled in the United States, many of those parts are not necessarily made here. So, which gets into parts of the domestic content bonuses that you can get on taxes. Most of this doesn't apply to a residential use case, but in certain commercial installations, the quantity of components that are actually from America can affect the tax rebate associated with that system. Those rules are constantly changing, so I haven't included any figures on there, but that is something to watch out for if you're interested in doing solar outside of a residential context. And I already touched on this a bit, but the scale of US manufacturing is quite small at the moment. That being said, there's still many of these companies are still producing, 5 and 10 megawatts worth of panels each year. But in the grand scheme of things, that is still quite a small proportion of the total production. Now, on the quality side of things, like I talked about in the last slide with the tier 1 and tier 2 modules, we do see quite a few tier 2 module manufacturers in the United States. So you can think of startups who are, trying to make modules over here. So there is opportunity there to pick up some great modules made in the United States, but then you also enter into the tier 1 versus tier 2, whether or not you want either one on your house, essentially. So worth considering, and that manufacturing base is growing within the United States, but it's not very well established as of now, at least. So with that, there's some other considerations that we also want to look at. Worldwide production is still predominantly China, Vietnam, Malaysia, and some other Southeast Asian countries. And that's not just on a panel itself, but like I was talking about earlier, the components that go into these products as well. So, and these figures are a little bit dated at this point, but as of, I believe, 2 years ago, China controlled roughly 80% of the polysilicon. So if you remember back to an earlier slide, that's the base component that goes into a solar panel. But on the wafer side of things, they control, I believe, like 97% of it. So making wafers is almost exclusively done in China. So even though a lot of these panels are manufactured in the United States, the wafers that actually go into those panels are all coming out of China for the most part. And it's the same with cells, modules themselves as well. But the deployment is obviously spread apart a lot more areas. So, and that sort of gets into the component side of things. Many of these things can be shipped over to the United States and assembled here so that they can qualify for made in the USA credits, but it's going to be a number of years until we have significant polysilicon wafers or cells manufactured in the United States. That being said, I don't know if any of you are from Butte, but the REC silicon plant that's in Butte actually does manufacture polysilicon currently. However, they are going to be ceasing that operation over the next couple months, just due to the energy demand in making polysilicon. That same company does manufacture polysilicon in Washington, but that Montana operation is unfortunately going under due to energy costs. They are, however, continuing to do, I believe it's the silicon gas side of the business, which is important in some step in the manufacturing of solar panels, but that polysilicon side is missing right now. Um, so like all these things, we expect that they will continue to uptick in the United States, and we're expecting more polysilicon, more wafers, more cells to be made here. But as of right now, it's sort of a piecemeal of a couple companies doing it. But even then, it's very hard to make the economics behind it work, like this Montana plant that we just talked about. Um, so yeah, it's going to be dominated by China for a long while, but hopefully we can start to offset that a little bit. The other, I think, big consideration that everybody should think about when you're looking into solar, and whether or not you should get it on your own home or if you're installing it, is just tariffs and the ongoing trade war. We've seen over the past like 6 to 8 years, the trade war between China and the United States has resulted in lots of different tariffs on specific materials, specific components, and even an entire like solar panel manufacturers. So that's going to be a moving target, and it will continue to be. One of the things that we've, at least at Greentech, had to watch out for, is regarding back tariffs. So there's, I believe, currently a lawsuit going on between a U.S. manufacturer and I believe the some sort of trade commission regarding tariffs that should have been in place on Chinese manufactured solar panels. I don't know all the details of it, but there's certain Chinese manufacturers where if the panel is not installed by a certain date, that panel could be subject to back tariffs, because there are new tariffs coming into effect on Chinese modules, which should spur more American manufacturing. But again, these things change quickly, and a large manufacturing business like an REC or a Q cell, it's very hard to move at the pace that some of these tariffs are moving to actually producing panels in the United States. So always something that's worth considering, and just watching out for. Ultimately, if you're going to have panels installed on your roof, there's nothing wrong with going with a panel that comes out of Southeast Asia or China. It's just worth considering, where your values lie with it, because you can get American made modules currently, but they can end up being more expensive, and will often have similar qualities to other panels. So worth considering. And the last slide that I want to focus on is mainly targeted at end users, and just giving a bit of context, and hopefully more understanding for the solar industry. I think because it is still so new and not a lot of people fully understand it, it's hard to know what you're getting. It's hard to know, on the quality side of things, or what you should be looking for when you approach an installer and ask them to install in your home. So I think the biggest thing you can do is, one, know what's going on your roof. Ask your installer what the degradation rate of the panels is. Are these panels rated for snow in Montana, or the wind or hail or whatever else the weather here can throw at a house? And just knowing that not all panels are created equally. And no two bids are the same from different installers. So asking what's actually going on your roof, I think, is very important, because it's something that's going to be there for 25 years and something that you will be relying on for energy. So I think it's important to check the components, know what's going up there. The second piece is know your installer. I think, growing up here in Bozeman, I definitely defer to, Montana-based companies, generally speaking. But I think it's important to know who's putting those panels on your roof, and those being people that you trust to do a good job, you trust to, come back and fix something if it goes wrong. A lot of this stuff you sort of can set and forget, and it will just produce power for you for, a couple decades. But there will still be issues. Not every system will have them, but there will need to be service work from time to time. So choosing a competent installer who will continue to go back, make sure your system's running properly, and take care of it and install it well is super important and worth putting time and energy into. um, the third piece, despite I think lots of social media ads, solar is not free. It's never going to be free. You can get lots of tax incentives right now for getting a system installed, but that does not offset the cost of doing that. These are, expensive pieces of equipment, and anything this large going on your house is not going to be free. It will provide long-term energy and give you some of that independence and lower your electricity bill over the long term, but it's never going to be free. So don't expect that to happen. And if it is free, I would question what products are going on that roof. But that's the general discussion I have about the landscape of solar and American manufacturing currently. And I'm open to any questions that you guys have.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Marty. It was a really good overview. We've got a question from Russ Doty here asking about the difference where some manufacturers, okay, so this is the domestic content. It's a question related around domestic content.
Mhm.
Some manufacturers have might qualify for a percentage of the cost in the Inflation Reduction Act, but other panels are either not US manufactured or have some components that may not qualify for the domestic content bonus.
Yeah. So um, within that, I know I think, I forget which department from the government released the numbers on it, but there's basically a breakdown by component. So whether that be inverter panel, attachment to the roof, and what percentage of it needs to be uh, sourced from the United States to qualify for those credits. Another thing to consider within this one, I believe some of it is only related to like TPO flat roofs, and then also larger commercial projects. So there is, there is additional tax savings within there based off of how much of the products are American manufactured. But what we always defer to is, reach out to your tax professional on that, on those types of specific questions, just since it's a bit of a rat's nest of different qualifications, different standards, and it's changing quite frequently. I think the last update came in May. So we're expecting that to probably continue to change over time. So that's going to be a moving target. Um, but I think generally, if you can, I mean, you can look it up online and see which companies are manufacturing within the United States. Those I listed above are great options. I think QCell, I forget where. Basically, if you look it up and you can see the production that's coming from these facilities, that's a good starting point at the very least. But for the specifics on that, I would definitely defer to a tax professional on that for a specific tax write-off.
Yeah, the other thing to note is that domestic content bonus can range from 2 percentage points up to 10 percentage points, but you're absolutely right. The IRS guidance is helpful, but trying to find those definitions of the percentage of domestic content for each product is very specific. And
Mhm.
and a lot of times feels like the only folks who can do that are the folks that have the staff to pull it off. But is my understanding is that is more designed for the larger projects compared to your household. Like the domestic content adder really isn't going to be for your distributed residential and small business. Is that correct, Marty?
Yeah. I think it's predominantly focused on any sort of commercial or industrial grade solar projects. So it's quite nebulous right now, and you definitely need a team of researchers to figure it out, which I think is part of why it doesn't apply to individual homes or any sort of residential context.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I think it's a bit of a rat's nest right now, and hopefully that'll get smoother and a little more defined as time goes on. But at least right now, it's just been a moving target.
Follow-up question here from Sam Hall. Is there an accepted definition for what percentage of domestic production of systems would qualify under BABA? So, Sam, I think your question there, domestic production, is that including assembled in the US? And perhaps Greentech might have some resources as a company maybe around that, if you might know them, Marty.
Yeah, I don't know anything specific on BABA or what exactly that might be. I can reach out internally to see if somebody's dealt with that. Um, but yeah, there's nothing specific that we have on that.
Question here from Jesse at Yellowstone Teton Clean Cities around, this is actually NEC and permitting with the city of Bozeman AHJ. He's asking about the 3-foot setback rule for solar installations, understanding that that might no longer be a thing, but a structural engineering review is needed to confirm the roof can hold a solar array. So Jesse, yes, I am aware that the structural engineering review is required, and that seems to be a trend that's happening in the larger authorities with jurisdiction. Bozeman isn't the only one. There's a few others that do it across the country, but that would be the rules for Bozeman currently. And I would refer you to, we had a solar permitting webinar for the Exploring Energy series. We brought on NREL and a UL specialist, and that was in fall, I want to say. Maybe it was fall of 2023. So I'll be sure to get you a copy of that. All right. I had a question, Marty, about tier 1 and tier 2, and you spoke a little bit to the origin of the difference between tier 1 and tier 2 panels, but I'm curious if you could tell us more about like how that started, and if you are a smaller startup company, what what's the trajectory that your company would have to take in order to get to tier 2? As an end user, is it how important is it to think about tier 1 and tier 2, if you're thinking American-made products from a newer company, for example?
Yeah, yeah. So the tier system for solar panels initially started in 2012, and that was that Bloomberg NEEF releasing that. And the general criteria to meet tier one is producing solar panels for 5 years or more, publicly listed on a stock exchange, or having a strong and stable balance sheet, having a fully automated production and a high degree of vertical integration, invest significantly in marketing their brand, and have a strong reputation for quality and service. So basically, and this is again why I tried to preface it as this is not a measure of the quality of a panel or how well it does the job of being a solar panel. It's a measure of the business behind that panel. And where that becomes important to the end user is on the side of warranties, whether or not you can get things replaced down the line, or continued service for the material that you're looking at. So it's basically just a list of requirements to prove that this company will be around, continuously, and will be able to, continue operating and continue supporting its customers throughout the lifespan of the panel. That being said, I think, there's nothing wrong with going with a tier two panel. There's just added risks, and I think you're exposing yourself a little more to that solar coaster that I spoke about earlier.
Yeah, thanks, Marty. That's helpful. Looking at that breakdown of 2% of companies make it into that tier 1 and the other 98 are all tier 2,
Hmm.
makes certainly stands out to me as far as how far we might have to go to keep reliable, trusted companies here for the long haul. When it comes to replacing a component or even replacing a panel, I see the benefit of having a long-standing company, and I know that that's something that Greentech Renewables cares a lot about, and all the installers that you work with.
Yeah, yeah, and on that note, we don't stock any tier two panels. Um, while we have 3 locations in Montana, there are locations across the United States. So the companies that make the list for what we can stock are basically exclusively tier one. And that's due to the volume that we tend to order this stuff in across the country. So anything you're getting from us is going to be tier one.
All right, I see a comment here from Russ talking about how his system, or the church and home system that they have going, is producing electrons at no cost after the upfront investment and the tax credits. So that's a note from Russ about his experience. Thank you,
Okay.
Russ. Any
Happy
other
to hear that.
questions here? Or questions from the group for Marty? Question from Brad: how many staff people does Greentech have in Montana?
I think total, I think we're at 9 or 10 total. So we're running, we're all wearing multiple hats. I still regularly have to drive material up to customers in different areas, even though my role would typically be a desk job. So we're running pretty small right now, but we're all very invested and focused on helping the installers do their jobs. So
Yeah. And Greentech has had a presence in Montana for how many years now?
we've been in Bozeman for 3 years. Missoula opened up last spring, and then Billings opened up this spring. So it's still relatively recent that we've been here. And other note on that, Greentech is actually a spinoff of CED. So we're under the same umbrella. CED is just purely the electrical side of things. And solar got big enough that it warranted having its own business. So we're connected to CED and sort of operate the same way that they do.
Right. Yep, great. Glad to have the Greentech presence in Montana as it's evolved over the past 3 years. Glad to see it grow. All right, question here about mono and bifacial modules. Tell us a little bit more about the difference, the popularity. Bifacial, I believe there's a couple models that just received UL listing for those bifacial panels, and I'm seeing them talked about a lot more in the Solar Coaster and in Solar Dialogue with the industry. Tell us more about that, and if you're seeing more of that in Montana.
Yeah. So bifacial versus monofacial, like I said earlier, is basically just dealing with how the laminate is set up. Basically having a clear back screen or some sort of back screen that emits light. But with that being said, on residential, we typically see monofacial for the most part. There are a couple bifacials that are more in the residential size that are used, but bifacial, broadly speaking, is kind of synonymous with commercial and ground mount. So bifacial panels tend to be a lot larger. And then they also have the ability to overproduce from their stated watt production. So there's like 500-watt panels that will, at like clock in at, 25 watts or more above what their rated production actually is. So typically it's a residential versus ground mount commercial delineation. And I'm sure there's a lot more technical differences between them as well. But that is a little outside of my scope of expertise.
Yeah, and the question here from Jesse about efficiency, like what can you expect from the power output? You just gave that example of a 500-watt panel clocking in 25 watts above its rated production, but is that generally the ballpark we can expect with those bifacials?
Not general. I mean, it's all environmental based. So like when they're producing 25 watts or whatever number it is above their stated production level, that's typically like a super sunny day. There, could be snow on the ground underneath the panels that's reflecting more light up to them and hitting those cells. So it's not like you're going to see that overproduction throughout the entire day or throughout the entire year, but it is something that can happen with those that we've seen with those bifacial panels. And then generally talking about the efficiency, that definitely ties in with the degradation rate. Different panels will have different ratings on that. So that 500-watt panel might be producing 525 on a sunny day, and it's excuse me, first year, but 25 years down the line, if it has like an 8% degradation rate, it'll drop by that amount, but it still can't overproduce. But that overproduction is predominantly environmental factors, and we get a lot of sunlight in Montana, so that's why we see it out here sometimes.
Right. Well, any other questions for Marty? Feel free to either unmute and verbally give us your question, or you can drop it in the chat. I think my closing question from the MREA side, and if anyone else has questions here too, I know we've got a little extra time, but as someone working on the distribution side and working with Greentech and having some familiarity with that company, I want to know what your outlook is for the solar industry in Montana at large. Like, what are you seeing from consumers and from your account contacts with installers? Because I know that you guys do that on a regular basis.
Yeah.
What are you seeing on that level? But then what are you anticipating, knowing that Greentech is a national company with all those national connections?
Yeah, I think I'm sure many of you have seen a bit of a growth in solar in Montana over the past year or so. I know year on year, Montana was the fastest growing state for solar in the country. I think it grew 200% last year from 2022. And we're expecting a similar level of growth this year. Um, it's it's a, a market that has not been tapped by too large part compared to like California or something like that. So we are seeing lots of multi-state organizations coming in and setting up shop and installing up in Montana. So we're seeing a huge increase in solar installations up here. Um, I know next year, I believe it's the Energy for All. I believe I believe Montana got like a $40 million grant over 4 years, targeting like low income um, Montanans and getting solar put on their homes. So there's federal funds coming in. Um, there's increased demand up here, and I think we're going to see it continue to grow in the state over the next year or so, at the very least. Um, and I think generally, what I hear from installers is I think a lot of people here want energy independence. I think Montana's that's independence. I think generally is definitely baked into what it means to be Montanan. Um, and so we see lots of people looking for that, and also just looking for savings on their electricity bills. I don't expect Northwest to cut costs anytime soon, and I think they're probably just going to continue to raise rates. So we see lots of people that are thinking about the future like that, and yeah, I think it's just going to continue to grow. And that emphasis on American made, I think, will continue to grow up here as well, because it is important to people. So.
Couple more questions coming through here. Vehicle to grid or vehicle to everything integration, how much of that is Greentech seeing, if at all, with
Are we talking like EV type stuff?
yep.
Yeah, I think we've seen an uptick in it. We don't sell tons of EV chargers currently, but I mean, the number of people who are getting batteries installed with a solar system has definitely shot up, and one of the common use cases is having a vehicle as well. It's not near at the level compared to other states. I think California is the classic example because they've been leading the solar industry for probably a couple of decades now, and require batteries installed, I believe, in some capacity with solar systems. So we don't do that yet at all, but we have seen a huge uptick in batteries, and with batteries, you end up seeing EV chargers trailing on after that. So I don't expect that to slow down. If anything, I think that'll just become more popular as time goes on.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And vehicle to grid seems to be one of those cases where the Tesla Cybertruck announcement with some of the, I think it's incentives or direct rebates you can get through Tesla for
Mhm.
installing a battery backup to allow you to do your vehicle to grid or vehicle to home, I guess we could say, for
Mhm.
powering your home in case of emergency. That's where the market is further along than the regulatory framework because we don't
Yes.
have we don't yet have the rules in place for how that would work if you're grid tied, and the disconnect requirements and all the safety components that go into that. So we know that that is coming and will be coming
Yeah,
the more the people ask for it in Montana and across the country.
certainly. Yeah, I mean, I think at this point, the vehicle to grid would more be seeing the vehicle as a battery connected to the solar system that's connected to the grid. So I'm sure that's down the line, but up here, I think the volume of EVs probably isn't high enough to be super meaningful in this on the solar side of things yet.
Question from Mark. What would you say is the greatest threat to solar growth in Montana? And is it the 2025 legislature? Is it something else?
Um, I would say, if anything, market instability. I think, going back to that solar coaster. I think, the solar industry, not as much in Montana, but across the country, responded pretty with a pretty negative downturn, following like interest rates going up. So I think broader market forces affect us quite a lot. Um, I think those incentives are still very important and help a lot, especially the grants going towards, like the Solar for All grant that I spoke about earlier. Um, but I don't know how much the legislature will necessarily affect it. I think make it harder, but I mean the growth is moving this direction. Um, it's not like our electricity grid in Montana is uh, able to handle the capacity that we need on its own currently. So I don't think there's any stopping the growth of it, but it could certainly abate that and slow it down. So
Got it. Again, going into that domestic content percentages is will green tech eventually be heading in the direction where your product spec sheets might indicate if the products that you're supplying would qualify for the domestic content bonus calculation? Has that been talked about at all internally or otherwise?
we haven't necessarily talked about that internally. And with that, us being in distribution, the spec sheets that we provide to customers are straight from the manufacturers. So if manufacturers were to start doing that and including that on those spec sheets, we would be providing that same information. So it's not something that we're necessarily spearheading, but um, I imagine if the demand is there, we'll start to see that from the manufacturer side of things.
Good answer. Then a question about from Gary here saying that he knows about power walls, but what are the other battery options that either GreenTech provides or some of your installers might provide?
Yeah, there's a great number of them. We provide the battery systems that we currently stock. We have the N-phase battery systems, which has to be paired with N-phase microinverters, which is one of the industry leading microinverters. We also stock home grid lithium batteries. Um, those, I mean, also great batteries. Those paired with DC systems. So think a single inverter coming off of that's changing the power. We do stock the Tesla power walls as well, and there's also Discover batteries. But there's all sorts of different battery manufacturers. I think we've seen lithium ion explode over the past few years, just because you can set it and forget it compared to traditional lead acid batteries. Um, but those four are the ones that we stock in Montana. We can order other brands, but those are the ones that we physically have here.
Right. Well, Marty, any closing thoughts for the group here? Again, we're very appreciative of your time and thanks for filling us in and also just cluing us into what happens in your world every day. That
Yeah.
that type of networking is really insightful for the association. So any closing thoughts or final words?
Yeah, I think just, appreciative of everybody showing up and being interested in this topic. I would love to give you guys more specifics on everything. I think it's one of the frustrating parts about where we're at with U.S. manufacturing right now for solar. Just that it is so new, and a lot of these pushes have just happened very recently. But I appreciate the interest, and yeah, I always like to talk about this stuff, and look forward to seeing more of these things being made locally, and yeah, just the expansion of solar in the U.S.
Absolutely. And we hope you stay at Green Tech for a long time because you're a really helpful resource. So we appreciate
No
you.
problem.
All right. Well, that concludes the August Exploring Energy series. We'll see you back here in September. We're queued up for September 4th. That's again Wednesday at noon. And if you are one of those folks that has a topic that you'd like to share with us, we're always really open to getting a better understanding of what's going to be helpful to the membership and our network as far as topics to cover through the Exploring Energy series. I invite you to do that. Thank you all for coming. Again, one more time, the Exploring Energy we're glad to have you here. Please consider being a member, and see you in Billings on August 24th for the Clean Energy Fair. Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.